Hello, I'm Maciej Mikos and you're watching World Talks. Georgian President Salome Zourabichvili has called for an immediate support from the EU to address the current situation in her country. She believes that Brussels should also impose strict measures against the government in Tbilisi. And to talk about it, we're joined by Alexandre Crevaux-Asatiani, Deputy Director for Foreign Affairs at the United National Movement. That is one of Georgia's main opposition parties. Good evening.
Good evening, and thank you for covering this.
So, first of all, do you agree with the presidential appeal to impose sanctions on the government?
Absolutely, 100%. And today we just received news that the United States and the United Kingdom were including some of the highest-ranking officials of the Interior Ministry into the global Magnitsky list. This is very important, and the reason why is because this regime is not an ideology-based regime. It is not one that is part of some kind of a global struggle between, let's say, communism and capitalism, or one of those old Cold War mentalities. This is a regime that is purely based on oligarchy and money. The moment that you start targeting these regimes with their money, that's when you will start to see real pressure being applied. That's what we wanted to see, and we're seeing it happen as we speak. And we're very grateful for President Zourabichvili for really taking a lead on this.
You mentioned oligarchy, but as a matter of fact, the very same measures were introduced against Russian oligarchy, and to very little effect.
I mean, that's very debatable whether or not they had an effect. Where Russia is a giant empire, unfortunately, with a lot of different ways for these people to turn their money around, to hide their assets. And yes, to some extent, I agree that this is not where the measures should be stopped, because we've been calling for sanctions against these people for the last 4 years at least. Since 2020, since the first fraudulent elections, we were calling for massive sanctions against Bidzina Ivanishvili. Those sanctions were delayed. Obviously, the first thing that comes to mind is that Bidzina Ivanishvili, who's the main oligarch in Georgia, and his allies inside the Georgian de facto government have had a lot of time to take their assets out of the United States, out of Europe, and to hide them somewhere. Maybe somewhere in Switzerland, maybe in Brazil, because that's what intelligence tells us now. Maybe in Russia itself. Not maybe, actually. We know a lot of it is in Russia too. So yeah, obviously those sanctions have been delayed. It would have been a lot better to have imposed sanctions without maybe 1 year or 2 years of warnings, because those warnings were just used as a pretext by these Georgian oligarchs to move their assets around. I'll be brief, but just a few months ago, this regime passed a law in Georgia that allowed oligarchs to bring their assets into Georgia tax-free, basically a subsidy to create Georgia into a safe haven for oligarchs. Yes, this is because of a lot of inactivity from the West, but we're glad it is better late than never.
Now, speaking at the European Parliament, President Zourabichvili warned the EU not to go back to business as usual with Tbilisi. But do you think that the EU is really considering turning a blind eye on the current situation in Georgia?
I think one very important issue with the European Union is they tend to avoid conflicts. And what we saw in Syria in the last week, with the European Commission now trying to take a big role, it's very unfortunate, because what this shows is that they're willing to get involved only once a conflict has ended, and they're never really there to help end conflicts. And that is a big problem with European institutions. They have the right values, but they don't have the will or the power to implement those values. And that's what we're seeing with Georgia. There's a lot of people that are, there's too many people that are trying to focus on other things. There's some people that are against doing the right thing, such as, the Hungarian and Slovak delegations. There's too much division within European institutions. And all of that is a conduit to then closing eyes on what's happening on the ground. Why? Because it's easier that way. So that's why we need to be there. We in the opposition, activists in the street, the president herself in Strasbourg, in Brussels, everywhere that they will listen to her. We need to all work as one to show the world we will not stop. And it's unfortunate to say, but I think that as the crisis deepens, there will be more and more reaction from Europe, but not because Europe will want to change its own power stance, but more because it will be forced to. Because the more the crisis deepens, the more it will impact trade routes. This Georgia is one of the most important trade corridors in the world, and that trade corridor passes through just 2 points: one railway, one highway, and 70% of the economy of Central Asia, of trade between Central Asia and Europe, goes through one of these 2 points. The moment these 2 points start to get a little bit threatened by the ongoing crisis, then we know that Europe will start waking up and will have to react. So what we really want is to make sure that these powers react before the crisis gets too bad.
Right, but what makes you exactly think that the situation should worsen? And what is the current situation? Is it the end of the crackdown on the opposition? Or are politicians and the pro-EU activists still a target for security forces in Georgia?
Right. So I do think that the crisis will deepen, because right now it doesn't look like the Ivanishvili regime is going to compromise or anything. And the more they're getting sanctioned, the more they're going to escalate the situation. That's something that they have warned about themselves. This is something also that we in the streets are ready for. And this is something that we're telling our partners. Right now, I'm in the United States because I'm trying to hold meetings with the upcoming Trump administration to see about what kind of a joint strategy we could have. But you know, at the end of the day, this crisis will get worse before it gets better, because the Venezuelan regime is not going to compromise yet, and also because the hundreds of thousands of people in the streets every day are not going to go anywhere. We fought for our freedom for way too long for it to just disappear because one crazy oligarch wanted to do that.
And let me interrupt you here. What's the unofficial or maybe already official stance of the upcoming U.S. administration about the situation in Georgia?
Well, I mean, President-elect Trump has not said anything on Georgia itself. In Georgia, the Ivanishvili regime has been telling people that they've already bought the Trump upcoming administration, which is a scandalous statement to make, but they claim that Bidzina Ivanishvili put a lot of money inside of the Trump team, and so they're expecting the relations between Washington and Tbilisi to reset, which is a complete ridiculous statement, because Georgia right now is a safe haven not just for Russians, but also for Chinese malign actors, for Iranian sanctions evaders. That's not something the Trump administration will close its eyes at. So we have to look at who will be the decision makers and the Georgia watchers inside the Trump administration. We're talking about Mike Waltz, the national security advisor, who signed a statement calling for sanctions against Bidzina Ivanishvili 4 years ago. 4 years ago. That's who's going to be the national security advisor. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, a great friend of Georgia, who is also a close personal friend of Mikhail Saakashvili, my party's leader, former president of Georgia, who is now in prison as a political prisoner. Basically, the entire administration of President-elect Trump is very pro-freedom in Georgia, and it makes sense. Georgia is a huge asset to have. It's a trade corridor, and the Trump administration will not want to abandon that trade corridor to China, Iran, and Russia.
Mm-hmm. Now, Georgia is obviously a big prize for any of major actors globally speaking. And the President Zourabichvili, she stated that the last parliamentary elections in Georgia were rigged by Russia, and its money, she called it a hybrid invasion, in fact. Now, do you already see any signs of tightening ties between Georgia and Russia?
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I think it's clear that when the entire international community condemns you, but somehow you're getting praised by Vladimir Putin, Dmitry Medvedev, and their propaganda machines, then you know that something bad is happening, and that's already happened. Putin himself praised Ivanishvili, as did Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. Basically, anyone who does anything bad in the world has already applauded this regime. We're seeing signs. Just a few days ago, the regime passed a new rule that allows Russian citizens to be hired into the Georgian police, which is already a pretty big red alarm, and those are very concerning signs. However, because 95% of the Georgian population is deeply anti-Russian, the Ivanishvili regime itself knows that the more they push that kind of measures, the more they'll have people in the streets, and the tougher will it be for them to walk back. Right now, at this point, and I'll be clear about this. One time, there was a time, still a week ago, when everyone was asking for new elections, and that was a way for Bidzina Ivanishvili to come out safe of this crisis, because he could have said, okay, let's have new elections. He would run, we would run also, and there would have been a battle on the elections, during the elections. Now, this isn't enough for us anymore. Now we want Bidzina Ivanishvili to take the same path that Bashar al-Assad took. We want him to get on a plane, leave to Moscow, and never come back. So the more time passes by, the more our demands are getting stricter, and we won't back down.
Your demands are getting stricter, but what about the enthusiasm amongst your supporters, pro-EU protesters? Our correspondent Tbilisi has clearly shown that the protests are slowly dying.
Just yesterday, 870 of the largest businesses in Georgia declared their opposition to the regime, with a lot of those declaring a strike. Those are things that have never happened in Georgian history before. Even when the end of the Soviet days, when the entire Eastern European region saw massive strikes, even then, even though Georgia was also known for its anti-Soviet feelings at the time, Georgia didn't take part in strikes, because strikes is just not a thing that Georgians do. Now those strikes are happening. Students are striking all over the country, and Georgian history shows us this. Whether we're talking about 1978, 1989, 2003, 2023, any time the students get involved, then the governments have to change either their path or themselves, and that's where we are right now. We're getting tired. There's no doubt about that. Everyone in the opposition is tired, because we're talking about full nights every night for the past 3 weeks, being spent outside in the cold, under the snow, with the tear gas, with the water cannons. It is exhausting. But this is a fight that our ancestors already started centuries ago when fighting against other foreign occupying powers, and we're continuing the same fight now against Russia. It's just that Russia is using Georgian hands to implement its colonialism now. That's why we don't have that luxury of getting tired. A lot depends on us, and we won't back down.
And so does Salome Zourabichvili say that she will not back down. She does not fear being removed from her office by force. So what do you think will actually happen to Madam President on the 29th of December?
I used to work with President Zourabichvili for a long time, and those were some of the proudest days I had working in Georgian politics. And I will tell you that she's a very principled human being, and she will not back down. And if something happens and special forces are dispatched to kick her out of the palace, I'm sure we can be sure of one thing, that they'll cut off electricity to the presidential palace, they'll cut off heating, they'll maybe even cut off water access, and that will be problematic. But if they dare to dispatch special forces to evict the president of the republic, you can expect, 200,000 people, 300,000 people to stand in front of the palace and prevent them from happening. Geographically, that presidential palace is within, very narrow streets, and you're putting 300,000 people there willing to defend her. Special forces just won't be able to do anything, and we might end up with a standoff. What will happen next? That is entirely up to the Ivanishvili regime, because again, this is not just about some political party or some movement or some ideology. This is about the very freedom of our nation, and we have a responsibility to that.
Alexandre Crevaux-Asatiani, Deputy Director for Foreign Affairs at the United National Movement, was our guest tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching, and stay with us for much more news and features here on TVP World.